Shadows of Anzio. The mud stuck to my boots like it had a personal vendetta against us, pulling and tugging every time I tried to move. The sound of it, thick, gurgling, almost alive, was everywhere. It was as if the earth itself was pulling us into its grasp, holding us in place, demanding that we stay. The air, damp and heavy, was filled with the sound of distant artillery, punctuated by the occasional scream of a shell tearing through the sky. But what haunted me the most were the sounds that weren't made by the guns or the explosions. The groans, the moans, the stifled cries of the wounded. I wasn't a soldier. Not in the way they were, anyway. I was a medic. And my job, despite the uniform I wore, was never about the glory, never about the medals. It was about keeping men alive long enough for them to see another day. And if I'm being honest, sometimes that felt like the hardest job of all. The ones who didn't make it, they were the lucky ones. That's what I told myself, at least. In the deepest pits of the war, it was easier to convince yourself of that. The Germans had us pinned down in Anzio for weeks, and if the mortar shells weren't tearing through the sky, the constant stream of casualties was. The stench of blood and gunpowder mixed with the musty, decaying smell of the earth itself. The sounds of life here weren't those of men speaking, laughing, or even crying. It was the ragged breathing of the dying, the faint sounds of men being dragged back to safety, only to be sent right back into the fray. We were all just waiting for the inevitable. Some days, I couldn't remember how many we had lost. Others, I couldn't forget the ones who slipped through my fingers. I can still hear the gasps, the way their eyes would look at me, desperate for a miracle I didn't have the strength to deliver. And still, there was something worse than death out there. Something that gnawed at you, at your humanity. You see, when you're surrounded by so much death and suffering, you start to lose your sense of what's normal, what's real. You begin to look at people differently. You stop seeing them as brothers, comrades in arms, and start seeing them as bodies to be moved, patched up, sent back out. It's easier that way. I wish I could say it wasn't, but it is. When the blood starts to pile up, when the wounds don't stop coming, you lose yourself in the task. You don't feel anymore. You just do. The first night I truly realized how deep the hole we were in was when one of the younger guys, Private Thompson, I think, came stumbling into the medic tent, his leg a mess of torn flesh and bone. He collapsed onto the table, his eyes wide with panic. I just need a hand, he said, gasping for air. I didn't look at him for too long. I didn't need to. I'd seen too many of his kind, the young ones, so eager to fight, to prove themselves. He'd be dead soon enough if I didn't do something, so I didn't waste any time. I started working, digging into his wound, trying to stop the bleeding. But he kept talking. I don't want to die here, he whispered, his voice breaking. I didn't know how to answer him. What could I say? That he'd be fine. That help was coming. The truth was, there was no help. Not for us. We were alone here. Alone in a sea of blood and mud. Alone in the darkness. I worked as fast as I could, trying not to think about how the minutes were slipping away. But something in my gut told me he wasn't going to make it. He wasn't supposed to. Not in this place. Not in this war. When I finished, I slapped a bandage on his leg, but it wasn't enough. It was never enough. He slipped into unconsciousness, his breathing shallow, and all I could do was sit there, watching, waiting. And that's when I realized it. That feeling of helplessness that I'd been pushing away, pretending didn't exist, was finally here. There was no more running from it. It was suffocating. The mud, the blood, the cries, they all became one. And I was right in the middle of it, stuck. But then something strange happened. In the distance, a light flickered, barely visible through the mist. It wasn't the flash of a mortar or the burning glow of a nearby shell. It was something different, soft, almost human. I thought maybe it was just my tired eyes playing tricks on me, but I couldn't help but feel like someone, somewhere, was still holding out hope. It wasn't much, but in that moment, it was everything. The idea that there was something more than this, something that could give us a reason to keep going. It was a flicker of humanity in a place that had none left. Then Thompson's eyes fluttered open, and for a moment, I thought he might say something. He didn't, but I saw it in his eyes, the same thing I saw in every man who came through that tent. Fear, desperation, the will to survive, but no real understanding of how. I stood up and grabbed my pack. Time wasn't on our side anymore. It never was. But in that flicker, I found something to keep me moving, even if just for a little longer. As I stepped back out into the hell that was Anzio, I realized that it wasn't the war that had broken me. It wasn't the endless waves of casualties, the blood, or the screams. It was the silence that followed, the stillness of it all. The only sound left was my own footsteps in the mud as I marched toward the next wave of suffering that would come. Because there would always be more. Always. The question wasn't whether or not we would survive. It was how much of ourselves we would lose before we did. And so we went on, like shadows in the dark. The days blurred together after that, the line between sleep and wakefulness growing thinner by the hour. At some point, I stopped trying to keep track of the hours, the dates. It didn't matter anymore. There was only the mud, the bodies, and the constant noise of war, the kind of noise that creeps into your bones, making it feel like you'll never be able to shake it off. Thompson didn't make it. I don't know if that was a surprise. Sometimes the ones you think will pull through are the first to go. I remember the last time I saw him, his face pale, eyes fixed on something far beyond the canvas of the tent. He was still alive, barely, but there was no fight left in him. It was in his eyes. That dead look. The one that tells you someone's already gone, even though their body hasn't caught up yet. It felt like a damn joke, though. How many more would there be? How many more men would stumble into my hands, their lives already slipping through the cracks, and I wouldn't be able to do a damn thing? The weight of that, it was heavy. We'd all been trained for this. Hell, I'd seen men die before. Hell, I even had my own close calls. But Anzio wasn't like anything I'd ever seen. Not even close. It was as if the war had set its sights on us. It wasn't going to stop until every single one of us was swallowed whole. I spent my nights with the dead and dying, patching them up or doing my best to ease their suffering. But you couldn't heal them all. You couldn't save them. Not when the world outside was falling apart. And sometimes I wondered if that was the worst part of it all. The not knowing. The waiting for death to make its move, knowing there was no way out. And then there were the nights when the darkness seemed to press in on me from all sides, when it felt like I couldn't breathe. It wasn't the fear of dying that got to me. It wasn't even the thought of losing my own life. It was the sense that we were all losing something much worse, that our humanity was slipping away, bit by bit, and there was nothing we could do to stop it. We'd been stuck in Anzio for weeks, with no sign of relief. The Germans kept pushing us back, and we kept trying to push forward, but it felt like we were stuck in a never-ending loop of bloodshed. Every time we thought we might break through, we were pushed right back into the same miserable hole we'd started in. We were being ground down, slowly but surely. There was no way to keep up the pace. The men were breaking, physically and mentally, and so was I. One night I couldn't sleep. I was lying in the mud next to a fire, staring into the dark, when I heard a faint sound, a soft scraping noise, like something dragging across the ground. It was too quiet to be a shell, too deliberate to be the wind. I looked up, but all I saw were shadows, flickering in the firelight. My hand instinctively went to the rifle at my side, but I didn't move. Not yet. Then, from out of nowhere, a figure stepped into the light. I don't know what I expected. Maybe a fellow soldier, maybe another medic, maybe just a lost soul trying to find his way back to camp. But it wasn't that. It was a woman. A girl, really. She couldn't have been more than 20, her face dirty, her clothes torn and ragged, but her eyes were what stopped me. They were wide, almost too bright in the flickering firelight, and in them, I saw something that hadn't been there in anyone for days, humanity. "Who are you?" I asked before I could stop myself. My voice came out too harsh, too suspicious. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she just stared at me, her hands trembling, as if she was trying to decide whether to come closer or turn and run. Are you one of ours?" I asked again, quieter this time, though I was starting to feel the first stirrings of panic. What was she doing here? There weren't supposed to be civilians left in this area, let alone women. She nodded slowly. "I've been looking for the medics," she said, her voice barely more than a whisper. I didn't move at first. I wasn't sure whether I should help her or send her back to wherever she had come from. But she looked so damn lost, standing there in the cold night air, her face gaunt and drawn. I could see the hunger in her eyes, the same look I'd seen in the men who'd been starving for days on end. It was a look that haunted you, that made you question everything. "Are you hurt?" I asked, though the answer seemed obvious. She wasn't just walking around in a war zone with no injuries. No, I'm fine, she said, her voice trembling as she glanced down at her feet. But I could see the bruises on her arms, the cuts, the way she carried herself. She wasn't fine. Not by a long shot. Without thinking, I reached out and grabbed a field dressing from my bag, moving to tend to her as best as I could. But she flinched when I touched her. I just need a place to stay. Please, she whispered. I didn't know what to do. She was a civilian, and I'd been trained to ignore civilians. They were distractions. They were liabilities. But as I looked at her, her eyes pleading with me in a way no man ever had, I knew I couldn't turn her away. Not now. Not here. I helped her into the tent, and she collapsed onto one of the cots, too exhausted to even say another word. I didn't know why I had helped her, or what she was doing here in the first place. I didn't even know who she was. But something in me, something I'd forgotten about in all the chaos of Anzio, told me that I couldn't just let her fade into the shadows. It was one of those fleeting moments that didn't make sense, but in the madness of this war, it was the only thing that did. I had saved her, but I couldn't help wondering if there was something more at play here. Something that none of us fully understood. I sat back in my corner of the tent, the night closing in around me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something else was coming. Something darker. I didn't know what it was, but I felt it in my bones, and I knew it would find us soon enough. I spent the next few days keeping an eye on her. The woman, I still didn't know her name, remained quiet, almost too quiet. She would sleep for hours, then wake up, as if startled by some distant memory that still clung to her. Her eyes, wide and haunted, would dart around the tent, as if looking for something she couldn't find. I had no idea what she had been through, but it was clear that the war had carved something deep into her. As the days passed, she became a shadow in the corner of the tent, barely there, yet always present. She ate only what we gave her, barely speaking unless spoken to, and when she did, it was always in whispers. But those whispers held something that the rest of us had lost. They held a sense of hope, a kind of quiet determination that seemed out of place in a place like Anzio. Maybe that was why I couldn't bring myself to turn her away. The others had noticed her too. They were curious, of course, but no one dared ask too many questions. In a place like this, survival came before anything else. We all understood that, but there was something in the way they looked at her. Like she was a ghost, or a vision sent to remind us of the lives we'd left behind, the ones that we'd lost and could never return to. I still couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Maybe it was the way the camp seemed to get quieter every day, or how the shadows seemed to stretch longer in the corners of my eyes. The battle outside raged on, but inside the camp, there was an eerie stillness. It wasn't peace, not by a long shot. It was a kind of uneasy truce, the kind that comes just before something worse happens. I felt it in my bones. I remember one night, after the others had gone to sleep, I sat by the fire, my rifle resting against my leg. The wind was colder than usual, and the smell of the earth, wet and stagnant, clung to everything. I stared into the flames, my mind drifting in and out of focus, when I heard a sound soft but unmistakable. A whisper. I turned, half expecting to see one of the others standing there, maybe one of the men trying to get some sleep after a long day of work. But when I looked, it was her. The woman. She was standing just outside the firelight, her figure a silhouette against the darkened sky. "Are you all right?" I asked, my voice low, trying not to disturb the others. She didn't answer right away. She just stood there, staring at the ground, her hands wringing together nervously. I could see the fear in her eyes. It wasn't the fear of the war or the Germans. It was something else. Something deeper. "You're not safe here," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I frowned, my eyes narrowing. "What do you mean?" She took a step closer, her eyes darting around as if she expected someone to be watching. "The Germans, they know about you. They know you're here. It's only a matter of time before they come for you." I shook my head, unsure of what she was trying to say. "What are you talking about?" "The Germans know we're here. They've known for weeks. We're surrounded." "No," she said, her voice trembling. "Not like this. Not like you think. They have someone inside the camp. Someone who's helping them." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. I had heard rumors, of course. The whispers that spread like wildfire when things went wrong. The idea that we weren't just fighting the Germans, but our own people too. Traitors in our midst. But I never believed them. How could I? This was war. There were always rumors. But something in her voice made me pause. Something in her eyes. I knew she wasn't lying. At least, not about this. I stood up, suddenly alert, my mind racing. Who? Who is it? She shook her head, her hand shaking now. I don't know. But they're here. Watching. Waiting. I took a step toward her, my heart racing. What else do you know? Why didn't you tell me this sooner? Her gaze shifted to the ground, her face pale. I couldn't trust anyone. Not until I knew you wouldn't turn me away. She swallowed hard, as if the words themselves were too much to bear. The air around us grew heavier, the sounds of the camp fading into the background. My mind was spinning. This was no longer just about surviving the war. This was something else entirely. Someone among us was feeding information to the enemy. Someone was a traitor. Who else knows about this? I asked, my voice sharp. I don't know, she replied. But you're not safe. None of you are. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears as I stood there, trying to make sense of everything. The camp, the soldiers, the woman, it all felt like a lie, like we were all trapped in a story that was spinning out of control. And then, as quickly as she had appeared, the woman turned and disappeared back into the darkness, leaving me standing there alone, my thoughts racing. I knew I couldn't trust anyone now. Not completely. Not after what she'd told me. But who could I trust? The rest of the night was spent in a blur. I didn't sleep. I couldn't. Every creak of the camp, every whisper of the wind felt like a threat. And when morning came, it was no better. If anything, it was worse. I kept thinking about what she had said about the traitor in our midst. I kept thinking about how we were all just one step away from being slaughtered, betrayed by someone we might have once called a comrade. But I couldn't let it show. Not yet. I had to act like I was still in control. Like I hadn't just learned something that could tear us all apart. The woman was gone by morning. No trace of her. Like she had vanished into the very shadows of the night. But I knew she had told me the truth. And now the only thing left was to find out who it was. To find the traitor. Before they found us. The morning was unnaturally quiet. The usual sounds of camp, the clinking of equipment, the murmur of men trying to wake up, the occasional shout from a sergeant trying to get the troops in line were muted, distant, as if they came from another world entirely. I couldn't shake the sense of dread that hung over me, thick like fog, the kind that pressed down on your chest and made it hard to breathe. I hadn't told anyone about the woman. Not yet. I didn't know how to. The fear of someone else hearing it, of someone else knowing that we had a traitor among us, was too much. It felt like if I spoke those words out loud, it would somehow make everything real. It would make the walls close and around us faster. So I kept it to myself. But that damn feeling, that cold weight in my gut, wouldn't let me forget what she had said. Someone was helping the enemy. Someone was feeding them our positions, our weaknesses. And sooner or later, that would catch up to us. The hours dragged on. We went through the motions. There was work to do, and no time to dwell on the things we couldn't control. We all just tried to survive. But inside, I could feel the tension building. The question gnawed at me. Who could it be? Who among us was the one working for the Germans? I tried to watch the men more closely, to study their faces, their movements, as if the traitor would somehow reveal themselves if I stared long enough. But it was impossible. They all looked the same. We were all just tired, filthy, broken men trying to stay alive. And in the midst of all that, who would even notice if someone was slipping away into something darker? It wasn't until that evening, when the sky turned the color of bruises and the camp was settling into its familiar, restless quiet, that I saw him. At first, I didn't know what I was seeing. I was leaning against a tent post, my back to the others, trying to stretch out a cramp in my leg, when I caught movement out of the corner of my eye. It was Sergeant Holt. He was standing near the edge of camp, his figure barely visible in the fading light. At first, I thought he was just taking a piss or checking the perimeter, but something about the way he was standing made me uneasy. His body was tense, like he was waiting for something. I couldn't see his face, but I could feel his eyes scanning the area, darting around nervously, as if looking for something or someone. I moved closer, trying to stay out of sight, my heart pounding in my chest. Holt had always been one of the good ones. He was solid, dependable. But the way he was acting now, it didn't sit right with me. As I crept closer, my boots squelching in the mud, I saw him glance over his shoulder, first one way, then the other, before pulling something from inside his jacket. A small bundle of papers. I froze. There was no mistaking it now. He wasn't just standing there. He was waiting for someone. And when the figure stepped out of the shadows to meet him, I could see it clearly. It was a man in German uniform. The world seemed to slow down. Everything in me screamed to shout, to run, to warn the others. But I couldn't. I was paralyzed, caught in the moment, watching as Holt passed the papers over to the German officer. They spoke for a few moments, too quietly for me to hear, and then the officer slipped back into the shadows, disappearing as quickly as he had come. Sergeant Holt stood there for a long moment, his back to me, his hands trembling slightly as he shoved the papers back inside his jacket. It was like the air had been sucked out of the space between us. I could feel the weight of what I had just witnessed pressing down on me, suffocating me. There was no denying it now. Holt was the traitor. He was the one who had been feeding the Germans information. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know if I should confront him, drag him out into the open, or if I should just let it all burn. What good would it do to expose him? Would the others believe me? Or would they think I was just as crazy as the stories we heard, the ones that warned of spies and traitors hiding among us? My mind raced. Every possible scenario flashed through my head, and none of them made sense. There's no way to fix this. No way to undo the damage that had already been done. I stumbled back into the camp, my mind reeling. I needed to talk to someone, to tell them what I had seen. But who could I trust now? Everyone was a suspect. I wasn't even sure I could trust myself anymore. But I couldn't let it go. I couldn't let Holt get away with it. Not after everything we'd been through. Not after all the lives we'd lost. I couldn't just stand there and let him destroy what little was left of us. I made my decision then. I would confront him, and I would do it before the night was over. If he was the one who had been betraying us, then he had to be stopped, no matter the cost. As I moved through the camp, my hands shaking, my thoughts in a frenzy, I didn't know if I was making the right choice. But the truth, whatever it was, had to come out. The longer I waited, the harder it would be to fix. I found Holt later that night, alone in his tent, the faint glow of a lantern casting long shadows on the canvas walls. I stood outside for a moment, my heart hammering in my chest. This was it, the moment that would change everything. I knocked. "Come in." Holt's voice came from inside, too calm, too collected. He didn't sound like a man who had just betrayed his comrades. I stepped inside, my breath coming in short, uneven gasps. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The silence was thick, suffocating. Then, finally, I couldn't hold it in any longer. "You've been feeding them information," I said, my voice low but firm. "Haven't you?" Holt didn't flinch. He didn't even blink. His eyes stayed fixed on me, his face unreadable, like he'd already prepared for this moment. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said quietly. But I knew. I had seen it with my own eyes. And somehow that made it worse. It wasn't just the betrayal. It was the coldness, the complete lack of remorse, the realization that he had been playing us all along, like we were nothing more than pawns in his game. "You've been working with them, haven't you?" I pressed. Holt didn't answer. He just stared at me, his expression unreadable, as if he was deciding whether to speak or remain silent. And then, in the silence, I heard it. A faint rustle from outside the tent. A shadow moving in the corner of my eye. I wasn't alone anymore. The camp had never felt so small, so vulnerable.